He said, I have signed all the other actors, and they're all in the pilot, and you were not, and you will have to be in last position. I said, well, I'm not going to be very comfortable with that. Then he turned to the casting man, who was also in the office, and he said, sign him up, and don't pay him too much money.
Everyone knows Lost in Space. The iconic robot, the campy aliens, Dr. Smith's theatrical panic, the Robinson family floating through the cosmos. It's a beloved piece of television history, beloved by multiple generations. But here's what almost nobody knows. That's not the show CBS originally made. Not even close. Before the colorful adventure that conquered television, there was a completely different series. One that was darker, more serious, and far more controversial. CBS spent $600,000 on a pilot that was so bleak, so intense, so far from what networks thought families wanted to watch, that they buried it. Completely. They rewrote the entire show. They transformed a genuinely dangerous villain into a comedic coward. They made decision after decision to create something completely different from their original vision. And they did it because the network had calculated what America was ready to see. This is the story of the Lost in Space that was deliberately lost. Of how a television classic was built on the ruins of something far more ambitious. And why what you remember might be exactly what someone decided you should forget. In 1965, something magical happened on American television. A show premiered that would capture the imagination of millions. It was called Lost in Space, and it arrived at exactly the right moment in history. The premise was simple but irresistible. The Robinson family, headed toward a distant colony planet, gets thrown hopelessly off course. Now, stranded in the vast unknown of space, they have to survive. They have to explore. They have to find their way home. Sounds like the kind of adventure that only existed in imagination. But in 1965, the space race was real. Astronauts were actually going to the moon. The Soviet Union was launching satellites. The future wasn't theoretical anymore. It was happening right now. And Lost in Space let families sit together on their couches and experience that same sense of wonder and danger and possibility. The show became an instant sensation. Families didn't just watch Lost in Space, they lived in it. The Robinson family became part of American households. Kids begged for action figures. Halloween costumes filled store shelves. The robot, with its iconic warning, "Danger, Will Robinson," became a character people referenced without even thinking about it. Dr. Smith's theatrical panic became comedy gold. The show generated water cooler conversations at work, playground discussions at school. It was everywhere. And that cultural reach mattered. Lost in Space wasn't just entertainment. It was a shared experience. Generations grew up with this show. Parents watched it as children. Then those parents watched it with their own children. It influenced everything that came after. Later science fiction shows, movies, the way storytellers approach space exploration in popular culture. References to Lost in Space still appear today, decades later, in shows and movies and casual conversation. Because this wasn't just a television program. It was woven into the fabric of American popular culture. The show earned its reputation as wholesome family entertainment. Parents felt safe letting their kids watch. There was adventure, yes. There was danger and suspense. But it was the kind of danger that families could experience together without concern. The Robinson family stuck together. They solved problems. They showed courage and humor. Nothing too shocking. Nothing too controversial. It was the kind of television that advertisers loved and parents trusted. It's the show we remember. Colorful, campy, entertaining, beloved. But here's what almost nobody knows. That show, the one that conquered television, the one that shaped childhood for millions of people, the one that became a cultural institution, wasn't the show CBS originally made. Before the colorful adventure that audiences embraced, there was something completely different. Something darker. Something more ambitious. Something the network found so risky, so commercially uncertain that they buried it. They spent $600,000 creating it. Then they rejected it. They rewrote the entire series. They transformed its characters. They made decision after decision to turn it into something else entirely. This is the story of how Lost in Space became Lost in Space. of how a television classic was built on the ruins of something far more ambitious, and why the show you remember might be exactly what someone decided you should forget. The original pilot was called No Place to Hide. It was not what anyone watching Lost in Space would recognize. There were no colorful aliens, no campy adventures, no theatrical moments designed to make audiences laugh. Instead, there was something CBS executives found far more troubling: a genuinely dark survival story. No Place to Hide presented the Robinson family in real jeopardy. The tone was serious, technical, focused on the harsh realities of being stranded in space with limited resources, failing equipment, and genuine threats. It was a show about people confronting the actual terror of their situation. The survival instinct. The pressure of knowing that one wrong decision could be fatal. It was the kind of science fiction that treated space as genuinely dangerous, not as a backdrop for colorful adventures, but as an unforgiving environment where human beings were desperately trying not to die. This pilot was ambitious. It was expensive. CBS invested $600,000. An enormous amount of money in 1965. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to $5 million today. The network was betting heavily that audiences wanted serious, dramatic science fiction. That families would tune in for a show about real survival, real consequences, real fear. They were wrong. When executives watched the finished pilot, something became immediately clear. This wasn't what they'd envisioned. The show was too bleak, too technical, too focused on the machinery of survival rather than the drama of human relationships. It lacked warmth. It lacked humor. It lacked the character dynamics and emotional connections that made audiences care about families on television. It felt like watching people in genuine peril, and that created discomfort rather than entertainment. CBS looked at the pilot and made a calculation. They looked at what was working on television. They looked at what audiences wanted. And they realized that the show they'd spent $600,000 creating wasn't going to work. So they made an unprecedented decision. They rejected it. This wasn't a small edit. This wasn't a few revisions to make the tone lighter. This was a complete rejection. The network decided that the fundamental vision of the show was wrong. The pilot was vaulted, archived away, locked up, hidden from the world. Not lost by accident. Not destroyed. Simply shelved. Hidden. Kept in storage for decades while nobody knew it existed. And then CBS did something even more radical. They completely rewrote the series. The network brought in new writers, new producers, new creative direction. They kept the basic premise, the Robinson family stranded in space, but changed almost everything else. They decided the show needed humor, needed heart. It needed characters audiences would love, not just fear for. They decided that survival drama wasn't what families wanted. They wanted adventure. They wanted spectacle. They wanted entertainment. This was the moment Lost in Space stopped being what it was supposed to be and became what it actually became. The rejected pilot sat in storage, unknown to audiences, unknown to most people in the industry. For decades, hardly anyone even knew it existed. CBS had taken their expensive gamble, lost it, and simply moved forward as if it had never happened. But the original vision didn't disappear completely. Fragments of it remained in the early episodes. Hints of seriousness. Moments of genuine tension. The darker version of Dr. Smith that existed before he became a comedy character. You could see what the show might have been if CBS hadn't rejected the pilot and decided to remake everything. The network's decision to bury that $600,000 pilot and start over wasn't just a creative choice. It was a statement about what television could be. About what networks thought audiences deserved to see. About the power networks had to decide what stories got told and what stories got buried. But CBS didn't realize something. The rewrite they were about to make wouldn't come from executives or writers alone. It would come from an actor who would interpret his role so differently from what was intended that he would accidentally transform the entire show. When CBS rewrote Lost in Space, they were trying to create something audiences would love. They brought in Jonathan Harris to play Dr. Zachary Smith. And here's where the story becomes unpredictable in a way that no executive could have anticipated. Dr. Smith was supposed to be dangerous. In the original conception, the vision that carried over from the rejected pilot, Dr. Smith was a saboteur, a villain, a genuinely threatening character who represented betrayal and danger within the Robinson family's group. He was the person who could destroy them from within. He was supposed to be menacing, unpredictable, someone audiences should be afraid of, even as they watched him. That was the plan. Jonathan Harris was cast in the role, and the producers gave him the direction. Play this as a threat. Play this as a man with ulterior motives. Play this as someone dangerous. But something unexpected happened. Harris interpreted the role completely differently. Instead of playing Smith as a menacing villain, Harris gave the character a theatrical quality. Smith became fussy, anxious, cowardly. Instead of a dangerous saboteur, Harris created a character who was vain and self-serving, yes, but in a comedic way. Smith became someone audiences found funny. His panic was exaggerated. His complaints were theatrical. His self-interest became absurdly obvious rather than sinisterly hidden. Harris wasn't rebelling against direction. He was simply making different creative choices. And something remarkable happened. Audiences loved it. When early episodes aired with Harris's comedic interpretation of Dr. Smith, the response was electric. Viewers weren't afraid of Smith. They were entertained by him. They looked forward to his scenes. He became the most interesting character in the show, not because he was threatening but because he was hilarious. His theatrical panic, his dramatic complaints, his ability to create chaos through cowardice and selfishness rather than calculated villainy. The producers and network noticed. They noticed that audiences responded to this version of Dr. Smith far more enthusiastically than they would have responded to a genuinely menacing villain. And here's where the cascade began. If audiences loved the comedic Smith, then what else should change to match that tone? The realization rippled through production. If Smith was going to be funny, then the show should be funnier. If audiences were laughing at Smith's theatrical panic, then other characters could be more theatrical too. If the dark survival drama wasn't what audiences wanted, then the show should become something else entirely. Something lighter. Something more comedic. Something designed around entertaining audiences rather than creating genuine tension. Scripts were rewritten. Darker material was edited out. Producers consciously made decisions to amplify the humor. The Robinson family's genuine survival struggles became less about real peril and more about colorful adventures. Strange aliens became less threatening and more visually spectacular. The tone shifted from "these people are in real danger" to "this is an entertaining adventure." And Dr. Smith stopped being a villain at all. He became the show's central character, the lens through which audiences experienced the series. Instead of threatening the family, he became part of the family, a cowardly, self-serving, hilarious part that drove the story forward. This transformation wasn't planned by a writer or an executive. It wasn't the result of network strategy or audience research. It happened because one actor made different choices about how to play a character. And when audiences responded positively to those choices, the entire series shifted to accommodate them. One performance. One actor's interpretation. One moment where what was supposed to happen collided with what actually happened. And the result was that Lost in Space became something completely different from what it was intended to be. But the show still wasn't finished transforming. Because in Hollywood, when one show's direction changes, other things change too. And something was about to happen that would force producers to make a radical decision about what Lost in Space should actually be. In 1966, something happened in Hollywood that would reshape Lost in Space forever. Batman premiered on television. And it became a phenomenon. The show was campy, theatrical, over the top. It didn't take itself seriously at all. Batman and Robin existed in a world of colorful villains, absurd plots, and comedic danger. Critics hated it. Serious television reviewers called it ridiculous. But audiences loved it. The show was a massive hit. Dominated ratings. It generated merchandise, cultural conversation, and enormous advertising revenue. CBS was watching. The network looked at Batman's success and saw something important. Audiences didn't want serious, sophisticated television. They wanted colorful entertainment. They wanted spectacle. They wanted camp. They wanted to be entertained, not challenged or made uncomfortable by realistic drama. And then CBS looked at Lost in Space. The show was doing well. It had found an audience. But it was still operating in a space between serious and comedic. It still had moments that took survival seriously. It still had genuine tension beneath the humor. It was balanced between what producers had originally envisioned and what audiences seemed to want. CBS made a decision. Lost in Space should become more like Batman. More colorful, more theatrical, more campy. Less concerned with realistic survival and more focused on entertainment spectacle. If Batman could be a massive hit by leaning into absurdity, then Lost in Space could be even bigger by doing the same thing. So for season 2, the network made a dramatic change. Lost in Space moved into Technicolor. This sounds like a simple technical upgrade. It wasn't. Moving to Technicolor meant rethinking every visual element of the show. It meant brighter sets. More elaborate costumes. Aliens that weren't threatening but visually spectacular. The Robinson family's spaceship became less about realistic engineering and more about colorful design. Every design choice shifted toward visual entertainment rather than believable survival equipment. The shift was deliberate and aggressive. Writers were told to lean into comedy. Producers were told to prioritize entertainment over realism. Each season escalated the approach. The aliens became stranger. The adventures became more absurd. The stakes felt lower because the tone was lighter. Season 2 was campy. Season 3 was even more so. The show kept accelerating toward pure entertainment spectacle. And here's the thing, it worked. Audiences loved it. Ratings stayed strong. The show became exactly what CBS wanted. A colorful, entertaining, theatrical adventure that didn't demand anything serious from viewers. It was perfect television for families who just wanted to be entertained. But critics were horrified. Sophisticated television reviewers watched Lost in Space become more and more campy and saw it as a betrayal of science fiction. They wanted serious stories about space exploration. They wanted the show to take itself seriously. Instead, they got increasingly absurd aliens and theatrical performances. The critics versus audience divide became stark. Critics said the show was becoming ridiculous. Audiences said they loved it. CBS chose audiences. The network understood something fundamental. Ratings mattered more than critical approval. Advertising revenue mattered more than prestige. Entertainment value mattered more than artistic vision. So they kept pushing the show toward camp, toward spectacle, toward pure entertainment. By season 3, Lost in Space had become something radically different from what it started as. It was colorful. It was theatrical. It was campy. It was exactly what audiences wanted. But the network didn't anticipate everything. Because even with all these changes, even with a shift to Technicolor and the comedic tone and the theatrical aliens, there was still something in the show that would make people deeply uncomfortable. Something that no amount of colorful spectacle could hide. By season 3, Lost in Space had fully embraced its campy identity. Colorful aliens, absurd plots, theatrical performances. The show wasn't trying to be serious anymore. It was entertainment, pure spectacle, and audiences loved it. But there was something the network didn't anticipate. The episode was called Castles in Space. It aired in season 3, fitting perfectly with the show's established campy tone. The plot involved the Robinson family encountering a villain, a character named Chavo. And here's where the story becomes complicated in a way that no amount of camp could justify. Chavo was portrayed with heavy racial stereotypes. The character had an exaggerated accent, offensive mannerisms, dehumanizing depictions designed to make audiences laugh at him rather than take him seriously. It was the kind of portrayal that seemed normal in 1960s television. A villain created through racial caricature, played for laughs. The performance was theatrical and absurd, which fit perfectly with Season 3's campy aesthetic. But something was different this time. When Castles in Space aired, the response wasn't what CBS expected. TV affiliates, the local stations that broadcast the network feed, started refusing to air the episode. Not all of them, but enough to make the problem impossible to ignore. Some stations simply didn't schedule it. Others replaced it with reruns of earlier episodes. The message was clear: we won't broadcast this. The network realized something had shifted. Audience tolerance for certain kinds of entertainment had limits. You could do camp. You could do absurdity. You could do theatrical villainy. But there was a line that even the campy 1960s wouldn't cross, and Castles in Space had crossed it. CBS faced a choice: defend the episode or remove it. They chose to remove it. The decision wasn't loud. There was no official announcement. The network simply decided that the episode wouldn't be part of standard syndication packages. When Lost in Space went into reruns, which is how most people would watch it for decades, Castles in Space would be frequently skipped. Affiliates and stations wouldn't have to make the choice to reject it. It would simply be unavailable. The irony is striking. CBS had transformed Lost in Space into a campy entertainment spectacle specifically because camp worked. Camp was fun. Camp was entertaining. Camp made audiences laugh. But this episode revealed something important. Camp couldn't excuse everything. Entertainment value couldn't justify every creative choice. There were things that even comedic exaggeration couldn't make acceptable. The episode became a ghost. Not officially banned. Not destroyed. Just absent. Missing from syndication. Skipped during reruns. If you watched Lost in Space as reruns throughout the decades, you might never know Castles in Space existed. It simply wasn't there. This wasn't the first time a network had dealt with controversial content. But it was a moment when the same system that had rejected the original Dark pilot, that had accepted Jonathan Harris's comedic transformation of Dr. Smith, that had leaned into camp because it was profitable, suddenly had to confront the consequences of its own choices. CBS had decided what entertainment should be. They had decided that camp was acceptable. They had decided that absurdity was entertaining. But they hadn't decided what their own limits were until they crossed one. And Castles in Space wasn't the only invisible history buried behind Lost in Space. Behind the colorful spaceship and the comedic aliens and the beloved characters were stories that never made it to audiences at all. Legal battles, copyright disputes, corporate agreements made in secret. Forces that shaped the show in ways viewers never knew about. But there's something else about Lost in Space that audiences never knew. Something that existed entirely behind the scenes. Something that shaped the show in ways viewers had no idea about. Before the Lost in Space television series premiered in 1965, there was already a comic book called Space Family Robinson. Western Publishing had created it. The premise was similar. A family stranded in space, exploring strange worlds, surviving against the odds. The similarities were close enough to create a legal problem. CBS was about to launch their television show. Western Publishing had already established their comic book property. And the two were too similar to coexist without creating intellectual property conflicts. So CBS and Western Publishing made a deal. It wasn't a public negotiation. There were no press releases, no announcements. The two companies reached a private settlement, an agreement that nobody talked about. The terms were kept quiet. But the consequence was clear. Western Publishing's comic would be renamed Space Family Robinson, Lost in Space. What audiences never realized was that the show's name and branding weren't purely creative choices. They were the result of a legal agreement between two corporations. The title that became iconic, the branding that shaped decades of entertainment, the name that defined a cultural phenomenon. It existed because of copyright law and corporate negotiation. This was just the beginning. Once Lost in Space became successful on television, something else happened. Merchandising. The show generated an empire of products. Action figures, toy spaceships, laser pistols, lunchboxes with the Robinson family printed on them, trading cards, bracelets. The robot became a toy. Dr. Smith became a collectible. The spaceship could be recreated in miniature and played with by children. Lost in Space was one of the first television shows to recognize that entertainment could extend far beyond the television screen. It could become products, could become merchandise. It could generate enormous revenue streams separate from advertising and broadcast fees. The merchandising was wildly successful. Children who watched the show on television also wanted to own pieces of it. Parents bought the merchandise. Toy companies made money. CBS made money. The entire ecosystem of the show expanded beyond the broadcast signal. But here's what matters. That merchandising success influenced creative decisions. If toy companies were making money from colorful aliens and spectacular visuals, then the show should emphasize colorful aliens and spectacular visuals. If playsets sold better when the adventures were fantastical rather than serious, then the show should become more fantastical. If action figures of eccentric characters sold better than action figures of ordinary ones, then the show should feature more eccentric characters. The decisions weren't necessarily conscious. Nobody said, "We need to make this episode more campy because it will sell more toys." But the financial incentives were real. The merchandising success created pressure, visible or not, to make creative choices that would maximize toy sales. Lost in Space wasn't just a television show anymore. It was a franchise. And franchises are shaped by business considerations, not just artistic ones. This model, where television entertainment exists primarily to generate merchandise, where creative decisions are influenced by toy sales potential, where the show becomes a delivery system for branded products, would later become standard in the industry. Star Wars would perfect this approach decades later. But Lost in Space pioneered it. Behind the colorful spaceship and the comedic aliens and the beloved characters that audiences adored was a show shaped by legal battles they never heard about. Copyright disputes they never knew existed. Merchandising strategy they never consciously thought about. The Lost in Space that conquered television wasn't just the result of creative vision. It was the result of rejection, transformation, legal negotiation, and corporate strategy. All of it invisible. All of it shaping what audiences saw without them ever knowing it was happening. But what happened to the people who created it? The actors who brought these characters to life. Where did they go when the show ended? The show ended in 1968. After 3 seasons of transformation, rejection, creative battles, and corporate strategy, Lost in Space concluded. The Robinson family's journey through space came to an end. The cameras stopped rolling. The sets were dismantled. The show that had dominated television was over. But the people who made it had to figure out what came next. Guy Williams, who played John Robinson, transitioned away from acting. He eventually moved to Argentina, stepping back from the entertainment industry entirely. The show that had defined his career also seemed to close doors for him. He chose a different life, away from Hollywood, away from the spotlight. June Lockhart, who played Maureen Robinson, took a different path. She continued acting. Her career remained active and vibrant long after Lost in Space ended. She embraced the show's legacy while building a professional life that extended far beyond it. Jonathan Harris, the actor whose comedic interpretation of Dr. Smith had accidentally transformed the entire series, became a major voice actor. He remained deeply connected to the science fiction community. He stayed close to the cast members, particularly Bill Mumy. Harris's career didn't end with the show. Instead, it evolved. He found new work, new projects, new ways to remain part of entertainment. Bill Mumy, who played Will Robinson, became something remarkable. He evolved into a musician, a writer, a voice actor, a science fiction performer. Of all the cast members, Mumy seemed most connected to the show's legacy. He didn't just move on from Lost in Space. He remained engaged with it, celebrated it, built a career that included but transcended it. Mark Goddard, Marta Kristen, Angela Cartwright, the other family members, pursued diverse careers after the show ended. Some continued in entertainment. Others moved into different fields entirely. They had lives beyond the Robinson family. They made choices about what they wanted their careers to become. Bob May, who operated the robot suit, became the physical embodiment of one of television's most iconic characters. His work, invisible to audiences, performed entirely inside a costume, helped create a character that millions loved. Dick Tufeld provided the robot's voice, the iconic warning, "Danger, Will Robinson." Together they created something unforgettable, even though most audiences never knew their names. The irony is profound. The show that had been so transformed by external forces, rejection, creative conflicts, corporate strategy, merchandising pressure, also transformed the people who created it. Some thrived within the show's legacy. Others had to build identities separate from it. Some embraced what Lost in Space had become. Others moved forward into different lives. But what connects all of them is this. They were shaped by a show that was itself shaped by forces beyond their control. They existed within a system of corporate decisions, legal agreements, creative transformations, and hidden battles. They performed in a show that was rejected and rebuilt, that shifted from darkness to camp, that generated a merchandising empire, that contained both beloved entertainment and offensive stereotypes. They made Lost in Space. But Lost in Space also made them. And the show's hidden history became part of their stories too. So here's what happened to Lost in Space. CBS rejected the original vision. The network decided that darkness wasn't what audiences wanted. They rebuilt the show into something lighter, something more commercial, something designed around what would sell rather than what artists wanted to create. One actor interpreted his role differently than intended, and the entire series shifted to accommodate that unexpected brilliance. A competing show's success forced a creative U-turn toward camp and spectacle. An episode crossed a line that even the network couldn't defend, and it simply disappeared. Legal agreements and merchandising strategy shaped creative decisions in ways audiences never knew about. And the people who made it all had to figure out who they were when it ended. This is the story of Lost in Space. But it's also the story of something larger. Because what happened to Lost in Space didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the result of networks making choices about what America should see. Corporate interests influencing creative vision. Business strategy shaping art. Power, invisible institutional power, determining what stories got told and what stories got buried. CBS didn't set out to censor or control. They made business decisions. They responded to audience data. They followed ratings. They pursued profit. These were rational decisions from a corporate perspective. But the cumulative effect was that the show millions of people loved was shaped by forces completely external to storytelling. And here's the thing that matters. We never knew any of this. For decades, audiences watched Lost in Space without knowing it had been rejected, rebuilt, and transformed. They didn't know about the legal battles or the merchandising strategy or the episode that disappeared. They didn't know that what they were watching was the result of compromises and corporate decisions and invisible power structures. They just knew they loved the show. And maybe that's the real story. Not that Lost in Space was transformed by external forces. That's just television. That's just how media works. The real story is that we were watching a show shaped by rejection and corporate power and hidden battles. And we loved it anyway. We created memories around it. We built childhoods with it. We passed it on to our children. The Lost in Space we remember isn't the show CBS originally intended to make. It's the show that resulted from every rejection, every transformation, every corporate decision, every creative conflict. It's the show that emerged from all of that hidden history. And maybe that's exactly what made it a classic. Not despite all those battles. Because of them. Because sometimes the most beautiful things are created not through pure artistic vision, but through compromise and conflict and unexpected choices. Sometimes what we love most is shaped by forces we never see. The Robinson family's journey through space might have been imaginary. But the journey of the show itself, from rejection to transformation to legacy, that was very real. And that's the Lost in Space that nobody knew about. Till now.